lost more than just a $1,200 drone that weekend. I lost my sense of security in the wilderness, my confidence in being alone outdoors, and honestly, a good chunk of my sanity. What I gained was footage of something that shouldn't exist and the absolute knowledge that I was hunted by multiple creatures across miles of Pacific Northwest forest. This happened last October, and I'm still having trouble sleeping through the night. Every time I hear branches breaking outside my window or coyotes howling in the distance, my heart starts racing. But I need to get this story out there because what I experienced wasn't just some random wildlife encounter. It was coordinated, it was intelligent, and it was terrifying. I'd been wanting a decent drone for years, mostly to get aerial shots of hiking trails and mountain landscapes. Nothing professional, just something to capture perspectives you can't get from ground level. My brother got me a DJI Mavic for Christmas, and I spent most of January learning to fly it around the neighborhood, practicing in the local park, getting comfortable with the controls. By spring, I was feeling pretty confident, but I wanted to wait for the perfect conditions before taking it somewhere special. You know how it is. You get one shot at that amazing location, and you don't want to crash your brand new drone into a tree on the first try. So I practiced a lot, maybe too much, because by October I was getting restless, itching to use it somewhere that actually mattered. The spot I picked was about 3 hours east of Seattle, up in the Cascade foothills. I'd been there a bunch of times as a kid when my family went camping, back when we actually did family camping trips before everyone got too busy with their own lives. There's this old logging road that winds up into the mountains, and most people don't bother going all the way to the end because it gets pretty rough. But if you can make it up there, you're rewarded with these incredible views of valleys that most hikers never see. The area is pretty remote. The logging road hasn't been maintained in probably 20 years, so it's all ruts and washouts and fallen trees. You need decent ground clearance and four-wheel drive, and even then, it's slow going. The payoff is total solitude. In all the times I'd been up there over the years, I'd maybe seen 3 other vehicles total. October weather in the Cascades can be hit or miss, but that weekend was absolutely perfect. Clear skies, no wind, temperature in the mid-60s. I loaded up my truck Friday evening and drove out after work, planning to camp overnight and get an early start Saturday morning. The drive up the logging road took almost an hour in the dark, dodging potholes and creeping around washouts. But I made it to my usual camping spot without any problems. I set up my tent near this little clearing where the road makes a sharp switchback. There's a decent view to the west from there, and it's flat enough to sleep comfortably. More importantly, it's far enough from the tree line that I wouldn't have to worry about branches falling on my tent if the wind picked up during the night. Saturday morning, I woke up to absolutely perfect flying conditions. No clouds, virtually no wind, visibility for miles. I had my coffee, packed some snacks, and hiked about a quarter mile from camp to a spot where I'd have plenty of room to launch and land the drone safely. The area opens up into this natural bowl surrounded by ridge lines with the road cutting through the bottom. Perfect for getting aerial shots without having to worry about obstacles. Those first few hours were incredible. I spent most of the morning just getting familiar with flying in that terrain, learning how the drone handled in the mountain air, getting comfortable with the altitude changes. The footage was amazing. Sweeping shots of valleys I'd never seen from above, ridge after ridge disappearing into the distance, old growth forest that probably hasn't been touched by humans in decades. I did maybe 6 or 7 flights that morning, each one lasting about 20 minutes before I had to bring the drone back to swap batteries. I was being pretty conservative with the range, keeping it within maybe half a mile of my position, just getting a feel for the area. But the more comfortable I got, the more adventurous I became. Around noon, I decided to push it further, to explore this canyon system I could see maybe a mile to the north. from ground level, you can't really tell how deep those canyons are or what's down in them. The drone was my chance to finally see what I've been curious about for years. I launched from the same spot, but this time headed north, following the main ridge line toward the canyon. The drone's camera was giving me this incredible bird's-eye view of terrain I'd never seen before. The canyon was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 300 or 400 feet from rim to bottom, with a creek running through it that I hadn't even known existed. I was about 15 minutes into that flight, maybe 3/4 of a mile from my launch point, when I spotted movement through the trees down in the canyon bottom. At first, I thought it was a bear. Black bears are pretty common in that area, and seeing one wouldn't have been unusual. But something about the movement didn't look quite right. Bears move in a particular way. They lumber. They're not graceful. But this thing was moving with purpose, walking upright through the forest with long, deliberate strides. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a person, maybe another hiker who'd found a way down into the canyon. But as I adjusted the camera angle and got a better view, I realized this wasn't a person either. The thing was huge, way bigger than any person had a right to be. And it was covered in dark fur from head to toe. It walked completely upright, not on knuckles like a gorilla, but actually upright like a human, except it was probably 8 feet tall and built like a linebacker. My heart started pounding. I mean, you grow up hearing stories about Bigfoot, seeing the blurry photographs, watching the documentaries, but you never actually expect to see one. You certainly don't expect to be flying a drone over one in broad daylight in perfect weather conditions. I started maneuvering the drone to get a better angle, to get closer, to get footage that would actually prove what I was seeing. This was it. The kind of evidence that people spend their whole lives looking for. Clear, high-definition video of a creature that's supposed to be a myth. The creature was walking along what looked like a game trail through the bottom of the canyon, moving with this steady, purposeful gait. It wasn't foraging or wandering aimlessly like an animal would. It was going somewhere specific. I followed it with the camera, trying to keep it in frame while gradually bringing the drone lower for a better shot. That's when everything went wrong. The creature stopped suddenly right in the middle of a small clearing. It just froze, mid-step, like it had heard something. Then it looked up, straight up, directly at my drone. Even through the camera, even from hundreds of feet away, I could see its face clearly. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The features were more human-like than ape-like, but larger, more pronounced. And the eyes were intelligent. Not the blank stare of an animal, but the focused, calculating look of something that was thinking, processing, making decisions. It stood there for maybe 10 seconds, just staring up at the drone. I was frozen too, finger hovering over the camera controls, not sure whether to keep recording or get out of there. Then the creature's expression changed. The curiosity turned to anger, pure, focused rage. It started moving toward the drone with incredible speed, not running on all fours like an ape, but actually running upright like a human sprinter. Except no human moves that fast through dense forest. It was dodging trees, jumping over fallen logs, covering ground at a pace that seemed impossible for something that big. I panicked and tried to gain altitude, pulling back on the controls to get the drone higher and further away. But the creature had already reached the spot directly below the drone, and it launched itself upward with a vertical leap that covered at least 15 feet. Its hands, and they were definitely hands, not paws, swiped at the drone and missed by maybe 2 feet. I pulled back harder, trying to get distance, but the creature wasn't giving up. It started climbing, actually climbing the nearest tree, moving up through the branches with the kind of agility you'd expect from something much smaller. Within seconds, it was 50 feet off the ground and still going up. The last image I got from the drone's camera was a close-up of the creature's face as it reached out and grabbed the aircraft. The eyes weren't just angry anymore, they were furious, intelligent and furious. Then the screen went to static. $1,200 worth of drone gone in an instant. The controller in my hands was useless, showing no signal, no connection, no way to get my aircraft back. I stood there for a few minutes, maybe hoping the connection would come back, that somehow the drone had just gotten out of range and would reconnect. But deep down, I knew it was destroyed. I started packing up my gear, hands shaking from adrenaline. Part of me was excited. I'd just gotten footage of Bigfoot, actual footage that would prove the creatures exist. But a bigger part of me was scared. That look of rage on the thing's face when it grabbed the drone wasn't the reaction of a dumb animal protecting its territory. It was the reaction of an intelligent being that was genuinely angry about being recorded. I was maybe 50 yards from my launch point, loading batteries into my backpack, when I heard the first scream. It came from the direction of the canyon, echoing off the ridgelines and seeming to go on forever. I'd never heard anything like it. Not human, definitely not human, but not like any animal I'd ever encountered either. It was loud, penetrating, and it made every hair on my body stand up. The scream lasted maybe 30 seconds, building in volume and intensity before finally trailing off into silence. Just when I thought it was over, another one answered it. This one came from across the canyon, from the opposite ridge. Then another one from a completely different direction, and another. Within a couple of minutes, I was hearing these screams from at least 4 different locations across miles of forest. They weren't random animal calls, they were coordinated, they were communicating. I stood there listening to this network of vocalizations spreading across the forest, and the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. These creatures weren't just individual animals wandering around in the woods, they were organized. They had a communication system that spanned miles of terrain, and they were using it to coordinate their response to the drone intrusion. The calls kept coming back and forth across the valleys, each one seeming to relay information to the next. I couldn't understand what they were saying, obviously, but the pattern was unmistakable. It reminded me of wolves howling to coordinate a hunt, except these calls were more complex, more varied. There were different tones, different rhythms, like they were conveying specific information. I started hiking back toward my camp, but the calls were getting closer. Not all of them, some were still coming from miles away, but a few were definitely moving in my direction. The creatures were converging on my location. I picked up my pace, trying to cover the quarter-mile back to camp as quickly as possible without actually running. Running would just make me more tired, and I had a feeling I was going to need my energy. But as I got closer to camp, I realized I was making a mistake. My tent, my truck, everything I'd brought with me was concentrated in one easily identifiable location. If these creatures were as intelligent as they seemed, they'd figure out pretty quickly where I was based. I needed to get to my truck and get out of there before they could surround me. I made it back to camp and immediately started breaking down my tent, stuffing everything into my pack as quickly as possible. I wasn't being careful about organization or protecting my gear. I just wanted to get everything loaded and get moving. The screams were getting closer, and now I was starting to hear other sounds too. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps moving through the forest. Every few minutes, I'd stop what I was doing and listen. The footsteps would stop too, like whatever was making them was aware that I was listening. That coordination, that intelligence was more frightening than if they'd just been acting on instinct. I got my tent packed, loaded my gear into the truck, and started the engine. The familiar sound of the motor turning over was reassuring, but it also meant that anything within a couple miles now knew exactly where I was. I couldn't be stealthy anymore. I put the truck in gear and started down the logging road, headlights cutting through the late afternoon shadows. The road down was just as rough as the road up had been, but now I was driving it with a constant awareness that I was being watched from the forest on both sides. About a mile down from my campsite, I had to stop. A large tree had fallen across the road since I'd driven up the night before. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and there hadn't been any wind that could have knocked it over. The tree was maybe 18 inches in diameter, far too big for me to move by myself. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, engine running, trying to figure out what to do. I could try to find a way around the tree, but the forest was too dense on both sides of the road. I could turn around and try to find another route down the mountain, but there wasn't another route. This logging road was the only way in or out. Then I heard the scream again, much closer this time. Maybe a couple 100 yards up the road, back toward my campsite. They had found my camp, and now they were following my path. I got out of the truck to take a closer look at the fallen tree, and that's when I realized what had actually happened. The tree hadn't fallen, it had been cut. The stump showed clear evidence of being chopped, and there were wood chips scattered around the base. Something had deliberately blocked my exit route. That's when the true scope of what was happening hit me. This wasn't just a random encounter with wildlife. I wasn't just being watched or followed. I was being hunted by creatures intelligent enough to set traps, to coordinate their efforts, to think several steps ahead. The screaming started up again, this time from multiple directions and much closer. They were surrounding my position, and my escape route was blocked. I had maybe 10 minutes before they closed the circle completely. I looked at the fallen tree again, measuring it with my eyes. My truck sat pretty high off the ground, and the tree wasn't perfectly horizontal. One end was higher than the other, where it had caught on some smaller trees as it fell. If I could get a running start and hit it at the right angle, I might be able to get over it. It was a terrible plan. If I got stuck on top of the tree, I'd be completely helpless. If I damaged the truck's undercarriage, I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere with creatures closing in from all sides, but it was the only plan I had. I got back in the truck, backed up about 50 yards to get some distance, and floored it. The truck bounced and lurched over the rough road, building speed as I approached the tree. At the last second, I aimed for the low end, hoping to use the truck's momentum to carry me over the obstacle. The front wheels hit the tree trunk with a tremendous crash. For a moment, I thought I was going to flip over backwards, but the truck's weight carried me forward. The undercarriage scraped against the tree with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. And then suddenly I was over it, all four wheels back on the road. I didn't stop to assess the damage. I kept driving, pushing the truck as fast as I dared down the rough logging road. Behind me, I could hear more screaming, angry now, frustrated. I'd gotten past their trap. For the next few miles, I thought I'd made a clean escape. The road was rough but passable, and I was putting distance between myself and whatever was back there in the forest. But as I came around a sharp curve, maybe 3 miles down from the fallen tree, I realized my troubles were just beginning. There was another tree across the road. This one was bigger, positioned at a spot where the road cut through a narrow gap between two ridgelines. There was absolutely no way around it and no way over it. It was a perfect choke point, and they'd blocked it completely. I stopped the truck maybe 50 yards from the tree and sat there with the engine running, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I started hearing the sounds from the forest on both sides of the road. Not screaming this time, but movement. Lots of movement. They were positioning themselves in the trees, staying hidden, but making sure I knew they were there. I realized I was going to have to abandon the truck. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, leaving behind my vehicle in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't have a choice. If I stayed with the truck, I'd be trapped in a metal box with no way out. On foot, at least I'd have options. I grabbed my pack, made sure I had my water and my phone, and started hiking down the road. The creatures in the forest matched my pace, staying parallel to me but remaining hidden in the trees. Every few minutes, one of them would break a branch or rustle some leaves just to let me know they were still there. The road continued downhill for another couple of miles, winding through dense forest and crossing several small creeks. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a pleasant hike. The weather was still perfect, the scenery was beautiful, and the road was well graded even if it wasn't maintained. But knowing I was being stalked by multiple creatures made every step terrifying. They weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. I could hear them moving through the forest on both sides of the road, sometimes getting close enough that I could see branches moving, sometimes hanging back so far that I could barely hear them. But they were always there. About an hour into the hike, I came to a fork in the road. The main logging road continued straight downhill, but there was a smaller track that branched off to the right, heading up and over a ridge. I didn't remember seeing that side road on my way up. It might have been overgrown and hard to spot from a vehicle, but it looked like it might offer an alternate route down the mountain. I stood at the fork for a few minutes trying to decide which way to go. The main road was the direct route, the one I knew led back to the highway eventually, but it was also the obvious route, the one they'd expect me to take. The side road was unknown territory, but it might let me break free from whatever trap they were setting. While I was standing there trying to make up my mind, the decision was made for me. I heard crashing sounds from down the main road, like something big was moving through the trees parallel to the path I'd been following. Then I heard the same sounds from the side road. They had forces positioned along both routes. I decided to leave the roads entirely. If they had both routes covered, then staying on established paths was just going to lead me into whatever trap they'd prepared. I started hiking straight up the ridge between the two roads, pushing through dense forest and fighting my way up steep slopes. It was exhausting work. The forest was thick with underbrush, fallen logs, and thorny vines that caught at my clothes and scratched my face and hands. The terrain was so steep in places that I had to use my hands to pull myself up, grabbing onto tree roots and rocks for support. But at least I was moving in a direction they might not expect. For the first hour of uphill hiking, the sounds from the forest gradually faded away. I started to think I'd finally lost them, that they'd given up the chase and gone back to whatever they'd been doing before I'd intruded on their territory. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard the screaming start up again. This time it was coming from ahead of me, from higher up on the ridge. They hadn't given up at all. They'd circled around and were waiting for me to come to them. I was being herded, driven toward a specific location for reasons I couldn't understand. I stopped climbing and tried to think. Going back downhill meant walking into the forces I'd been fleeing from. Going forward meant walking into whatever trap they'd prepared on the ridgetop. Going sideways along the slope was possible, but it would take me further from any established trails or roads, deeper into wilderness, where I might get completely lost. While I was trying to decide what to do, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices, not screaming or howling, but actual voices. They were too far away and too distorted by the forest for me to make out any words, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably conversational. They were talking to each other. I decided to head sideways along the slope, trying to stay at roughly the same elevation while moving away from the voices. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks, steep drops, areas where the slope was so unstable that every step sent a small avalanche of dirt and stones sliding downhill. But it was better than walking into whatever they had planned for me. I'd been moving laterally for maybe half an hour when I came to the edge of a steep ravine. It cut straight down the mountainside like a scar, maybe 200 feet deep with nearly vertical walls. A small stream ran along the bottom, probably runoff from snowmelt higher up on the mountain. The ravine presented both an obstacle and an opportunity. I couldn't cross it, the gap was too wide and the walls too steep. but if I could find a way down to the bottom, it might provide a route away from my pursuers. The creatures had been staying on the ridgelines and slopes, moving through the forest cover. They might not be willing or able to follow me down into the ravine. I found a spot where the wall was slightly less vertical and started climbing down. It was dangerous work. The rock was loose and crumbly, and there weren't many good handholds. Several times I nearly lost my grip and fell, catching myself at the last second. But slowly, carefully, I made my way down toward the stream at the bottom. I was about halfway down when disaster struck. I was reaching for what looked like a solid handhold when the rock gave way completely. A whole section of the ravine wall collapsed, taking me with it in an avalanche of stone and dirt. I remember the sensation of falling, the feeling of loose rock sliding past me, the desperate scramble to find something solid to grab onto. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying at the bottom of the ravine next to the stream, covered in dirt and debris. My left ankle was twisted at an angle that didn't look right, and when I tried to move it, the pain was excruciating. I'd definitely broken something, possibly in multiple places. My pack had come off during the fall and was scattered around the ravine bottom. I managed to crawl over to where my water bottle had landed and take a drink, trying to clear my head and assess the situation. The sun was getting low in the sky. I'd lost at least a couple of hours to unconsciousness. Looking up at the ravine walls from the bottom, I realized how precarious my situation was. Even with 2 good ankles, climbing back up would have been nearly impossible. With one ankle badly injured, it was completely out of the question. I was trapped at the bottom of the ravine with limited supplies and no way to call for help. My phone had no signal at that depth, but there was one silver lining. It was quiet. No screaming, no sound of movement through the forest, no voices. Either the creatures hadn't seen me fall, or they weren't willing to follow me down into the ravine. For the first time in hours, I felt like I wasn't being actively hunted. I spent what was left of the daylight exploring my immediate surroundings, looking for anything that might help my situation. The ravine bottom was maybe 20 feet wide, filled with loose rocks and fallen trees that had tumbled down from above over the years. The stream was clear and cold, so I had access to fresh water. But there was no food, no shelter materials, and most importantly, no obvious way out. The ravine walls were too steep and too unstable to climb, especially with an injured ankle. Following the stream downhill might eventually lead me out of the ravine, but it could just as easily lead to a waterfall or another dead end. Following it uphill would take me back toward the area where I'd encountered the creatures. As darkness fell, the temperature started dropping rapidly. I hadn't brought cold weather gear. The afternoon had been warm and pleasant, and I'd expected to be back at my truck before nightfall. Now I was looking at spending the night outdoors in mountain conditions with no sleeping bag, no warm clothes, and a serious injury. I found a spot where a large tree had fallen across the ravine, creating a natural shelter underneath. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the wind and any rain that might develop during the night. I gathered what dry wood I could find and managed to get a small fire started using the emergency lighter from my pack. The fire helped with both warmth and morale, but it also made me visible to anything that might be looking down into the ravine from above. I tried to keep it small, just enough to take the edge off the cold, but even a small fire creates a glow that can be seen from a considerable distance in the dark. I'd been sitting by the fire for maybe an hour trying to figure out what to do when morning came, when I started hearing sounds from above. Not the screaming this time, but movement. Footsteps along the rim of the ravine, stopping every few yards as if whatever was making them was looking down into the darkness. The sounds moved along the entire length of the ravine that I could hear, from far upstream to far downstream. They were conducting a systematic search, checking every section of the rim, Eventually, inevitably, they found the spot where I'd fallen. I heard rocks clattering down the wall, dislodged by something moving around up there. Then silence, complete, absolute silence that was somehow more frightening than all the noise had been. They knew where I was, but they weren't coming down after me. They were just waiting. I kept the fire burning through the night, feeding it small pieces of wood whenever it started to die down. Every time I moved, every time I added fuel to the flames, I could hear slight sounds from above. They were still there, still watching, patient. Around midnight, the sounds changed. Instead of the heavy footsteps of large creatures moving around the rim, I started hearing lighter sounds, scratching, scraping, like claws on rock. Something was climbing down the ravine wall. I couldn't see anything beyond the circle of light cast by my small fire, but I could hear whatever it was making its way down the wall with careful, deliberate movements. Not falling or sliding like I had, but actually climbing down with the skill and confidence of something that had done this many times before. I found a piece of wood that was heavy enough to use as a club and sat with my back to the fallen tree, watching the darkness beyond my fire. The climbing sounds got closer and closer until I was sure whatever was making them was almost at the bottom of the ravine. Then the sound stopped. Just like before, the sudden silence was more frightening than the noise had been. Something was down there in the darkness with me, close enough to see the fire, probably close enough to see me sitting beside it, but I couldn't see it. I threw a piece of wood into the darkness where I thought the sounds had been coming from. It clattered off the rocks and rolled into the stream, but there was no reaction, no sound of movement or surprise. Either I'd missed completely, or whatever was out there had nerves of steel. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I kept feeding the fire and scanning the darkness, but I never saw or heard anything definitive. Eventually, exhaustion started to overcome fear. My ankle was throbbing, I was cold and tired, and the stress of the entire day was catching up with me. I must have dozed off sitting up against the fallen tree because the next thing I knew it was dawn and my fire had burned down to cold ashes. When I looked around the ravine bottom in the gray morning light, I found tracks in the sandy soil near the stream. Not human tracks, but not quite animal tracks either. Something with feet like a human but much larger, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. The tracks circled my campsite at a distance of maybe 30 feet, as if whatever had made them had spent time observing me while I slept, but hadn't wanted to get too close to the fire. There were no tracks leading back up the ravine wall, which meant whatever had made them was either still down there with me or had found another way out. I spent the first hour after sunrise planning my next move. Staying in the ravine wasn't an option. I had no food, limited water, and a badly injured ankle that was only going to get worse without medical attention. But climbing out was also impossible, at least at that location. Following the stream seemed like my best bet. The ravine had to end somewhere, either at a larger valley or at a point where the walls became low enough to climb. I gathered what supplies I could from my scattered pack, made a crude walking stick from a piece of driftwood, and started hobbling downstream. Progress was slow and painful. The ravine bottom was filled with loose rocks and fallen trees that I had to navigate around or climb over. With only one good ankle, every step was an ordeal. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that staying put meant certain death. After about an hour of painful progress, I started hearing the sounds from above again. They were following me along the rim of the ravine, keeping pace with my slow movement downstream. But they still weren't coming down after me, which gave me hope that the ravine walls provided some real protection. The walls gradually got lower as I moved downstream and the ravine got wider. Eventually, I reached a point where the stream flowed out into a broader valley, and the ravine walls were only maybe 50 feet high, still too steep to climb with an injured ankle, but much more reasonable than the 200-foot cliffs I'd fallen down. The valley opened up into an area I actually recognized. Not well, but I'd seen it from higher elevations during previous hiking trips. It was still miles from any road, but at least I knew roughly where I was and which direction would take me towards civilization. More importantly, the sounds from my pursuers had stopped. Either they'd given up the chase, or the more open terrain of the valley made them reluctant to continue following me. For the first time since I'd spotted that first creature through my drone camera, I felt like I might actually make it out alive. I followed the stream through the valley for most of the morning, moving as fast as my injured ankle would allow. The terrain was much easier than the ravine bottom had been. Mostly open meadows with scattered trees, gentle slopes instead of vertical walls. But every step was still agony, and I could feel my ankle swelling inside my boot. Around midday, I reached a point where the stream crossed under what looked like an old Forest Service road. It was overgrown and clearly hadn't been used in years, but it was definitely a road, which meant it had to lead somewhere. I turned east, toward where I thought the main highway might be, and started following the abandoned track. The Forest Service road wound through the mountains for what felt like forever. Sometimes it climbed steeply uphill, forcing me to stop frequently to rest and catch my breath. Sometimes it descended into valleys where the walking was easier, but the ankle pain was worse. Always it seemed to be taking me further from civilization rather than closer to it. I'd been walking for maybe 6 hours when I finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world: traffic, actual vehicles moving along an actual paved road. The Forest Service track came to an end at a small gravel parking area beside a 2-lane highway, and suddenly I was back in the real world. I flagged down the first car that came by, and the driver, a local rancher who was familiar with the area, agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town. He didn't ask too many questions about why I was hobbling around in the middle of nowhere with a badly swollen ankle and clothes torn to shreds, which I appreciated. The town had a small medical clinic where they confirmed that I'd broken my ankle in 2 places and badly sprained the other one. They gave me pain medication, fitted me with a walking boot, and told me to see an orthopedic specialist as soon as I got home. The doctor asked how I'd injured myself, and I told him I'd fallen while hiking. It was technically true. I called a friend to come pick me up rather than trying to explain to my family why my truck was abandoned somewhere up in the mountains. We drove back up the logging road the next day to retrieve it. I figured the creatures had probably moved on, and I was right. The truck was still sitting where I'd left it, blocked by the fallen tree, but otherwise undamaged. My friend helped me clear the tree from the road so we could get the truck out, and we drove it back to town without incident. He asked about the scrape marks on the undercarriage from where I'd tried to drive over the first fallen tree, and I told him I'd hit a rock. Another technically true explanation. The strangest part was that there was no trace of the drone. I'd expected to find wreckage scattered around the area where it had been destroyed, but there was nothing. No pieces of plastic or metal, no battery pack, no memory card. Whatever had happened to it after the creature grabbed it, the evidence had been completely eliminated. It's been almost a year since the incident, and I still have trouble believing it actually happened. The broken ankle healed eventually, though I still get aches when the weather changes. The walking boot is gone, but the memories remain as vivid as ever. I've told this story to a few close friends, and most of them think I had a concussion from the fall and imagine the whole thing. They figure I crashed my drone into a tree, got lost trying to retrieve it, and fell down the ravine during a bout of confusion. It's a reasonable explanation, and probably what I'd think if someone else told me the same story. But I know what I saw, I know what I experienced, and I know that there are creatures living in those mountains that are far more intelligent and organized than anything we've officially acknowledged exists. I've thought about going back, maybe with better equipment and more people, to see if I can find evidence of what I encountered. But every time I seriously consider it, I remember that look of pure rage on the creature's face when it grabbed my drone. They didn't want to be recorded, and they went to extraordinary lengths to prevent my escape after I'd seen them. I don't think they'd be any happier to see me a second time. The footage I got before the drone was destroyed is gone forever, along with the aircraft itself. Sometimes I wonder if that was the real goal all along, not to hurt me, but to make sure no evidence of their existence made it back to the outside world. If so, they succeeded completely. So what were they? I've spent countless hours researching every possibility I can think of. Bears don't coordinate hunts across miles of territory. Gorillas don't set traps by cutting down trees. Humans don't move through dense forest with that kind of speed and agility. And they certainly don't have the physical strength to leap 15 feet vertically from a standing position. The only explanation that fits all the evidence is the one that sounds the most incredible, that there's a species of large, intelligent bipedal creatures living in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Creatures that have learned to avoid human contact, to eliminate evidence of their existence, and to coordinate their activities across vast territories. If you believe the Native American legends, they've been there all along. If you believe the modern skeptics, they're impossible. But if you believe what I saw through that drone camera, what I heard echoing across those valleys, what hunted me for hours through that forest, then you have to accept that there are things in this world that science hasn't cataloged yet. I keep the drone controller on my desk as a reminder, $1,200 worth of equipment reduced to a useless piece of plastic and circuitry. But also proof that the experience was real, that I didn't imagine it all during some kind of medical emergency. Every now and then I'll get the urge to buy another drone to go back up there and try again with better preparation and different tactics. But then I remember those intelligent, furious eyes staring up at me through the camera, and I realize that some discoveries aren't worth making twice. Whatever is living up there in those mountains, they've made it clear that they want to be left alone. And after what I experienced, I'm inclined to respect that wish. I just hope that the next person who stumbles onto their territory is as lucky as I was to make it out alive. For more interesting stories, check this out.